And so then we'd discharge them back home with a better plan and more support, and they could be at home doing the things they want with the people they loved until the end of their life. Yeah, we had great joy. People always say, you worked in hospice, it must have been terribly sad. I don't think I've ever laughed so much in any other job. There was a lot of joy in amongst the sadness.
I am Timothy Giles. This is a series of conversations about living life fully when life throws something at us that we didn't really want to deal with, and we can be at a loss of how to. One of the things that can help is maybe if the grown-ups, whether it's mum and dad or someone else who were caring for you and raising you, talked about death around the dinner table. Sarah Cannon, Kelda, g'day.
Hi, Tim.
If your kids bring someone home, they have to have a bit of a warning to say, Mum might talk about death.
Absolutely. It takes me back to my oldest son bringing his girlfriend home for the first time, and that was definitely a warning that he gave her, because I know that a lot of children aren't spoken to about death, and in our house, around the dinner table, any conversation goes.
Yeah, any conversation, you say that, but I just had the privilege of meeting your very handsome boy, right? Like, ridiculously handsome young man. Actually, some details about death and about the biology of death and the fact of what happens to a body in death. And he's talking about the release of bodily fluids. And this is a conversation that happens in your house and has done right the way through their life.
Yep, definitely.
Why?
Because as long as I've been a parent, I've worked in the death industry. And so death has always been part of our conversation, because I think it's important to talk about what goes on in your day-to-day life. And for me, that was dealing with death. And so I openly had those conversations with my children and hoped that that would prepare them when death came in their lives.
So on the one hand, there's mum's emotional experience of, I lost, so from nursing, right? You were nursing in the early days with your children?
Yep, I was a hospice nurse.
So I've met you as a funeral director.
Yes.
But nursing is how you ended up into this part of working with people around death?
Yep.
Okay, hospice nurse. So emotionally, I understand that thing of how was your day, kids? This is how mum's day was. And if you were going to share a really good day, but then also a day when you've had a really tough day, what might those conversations have looked like?
Would depend on the age. Okay. Totally depend on the age and stage and the question. So my philosophy as a parent is that I only answer the questions that they ask me, and I never give them more information than they've asked for. So if it's a general, "Hi Mum, how's your day?" I would go, "It's actually been a really tough day today." And if they don't ask me any more questions about my tough day, then I don't give them any more information. But if they're able or wanting to know more information, then I give them that.
How far do you go in the information? And you talked about age and stage, right? Like, so your boy was laughing about, and, you know, trigger warning, if you're not wanting to have these conversations, this is probably not the podcast conversation you want to be listening to right now. But he talked about you having to take care of body fluids leaking out of someone who is deceased.
Yeah, that's part of what I do in my job. And so I would say it's been a bit of a messy day today, again, and they're older now. All my children are teenagers.
What do you mean, Mum? What do you mean messy? Messy how?
Yeah. And I would say, well, there was fluid that came out of their mouth, or they bled from a line that was in their arm, or I don't give graphic detail, but they know that bodies do project fluid.
Okay. And most of us don't.
No. And probably a lot of people don't know that because and historically in New Zealand, we have embalmed most of our deceased people. And in the funeral home that I work in, we don't embalm a lot of our people. So
the embalming process begins with taking out all of the body fluids,
yes.
right? If we don't do that, what's going to happen?
Well, it depends on how you've died. So for me, being a nurse is really helpful because I understand the pathophysiology of the disease process. And so I will know if someone is more likely to leak body fluids than others. And so that would be my advice to a family of whether they want to take someone home, whether they would need to be embalmed or not. So, yeah, if they're not going home, then there isn't always the need to embalm as long as we keep their body cool, even if they are leaking. They tend to leak while they're warm. Once they've cooled for a period of time, that risk of leaking does diminish.
Okay. I think we should do a podcast episode about the physiology of death at some point. That would be interesting and I think vital for those of us who've been raised without parents who have these conversations, right?
Yeah.
The emotional side then of death, and so many of us, and I hear it, take the kids outside. We don't want the kids to hear about this or know about this. That's not how you as a parent have raised your children, and that's not how you would suggest we parent?
Each to their own. I'm not gonna tell people how to parent their children.
Okay.
But I have found in my experience that having those open conversations means that you can go forward and have more conversations. And it only enhances their understanding of the process or the reasons for their feelings or their grief process. But in saying that, my 18-year-old son told me only 6 months ago that he still hasn't grieved the loss of a dear friend of ours from 5 years ago. So even though we have had those open conversations as a family, that process for him hasn't been easy.
Grief frequently isn't easy.
No.
Do
never.
you see a distinction between understanding death and the process of dying and the loss of someone, the end of their life and they're not around anymore, from the grieving process, or are they the same thing?
They can be separate, but it depends on how somebody's died. If somebody dies suddenly, there isn't a disease process to understand or a dying process. It's sudden. You weren't expecting it. There's always going to be questions. And so the grief in having a sudden death is much harder to navigate.
This is a heart attack, a car crash, anything of that nature.
Murder or suicide. There's all of those I consider a sudden death. It's when you have not been unwell and there is no preparation for your dying. But also, I think the language we use and the conversations that we have can start really, really young.
So you've got preferred words. What are you talking about? What language?
So you use dead and dying. You don't use sleeping.
Even for little ones?
Even for little ones. Even for little ones. And it can be as easy as, look, it's autumn. Those trees' leaves are dying or they're dead on the ground. And that can be a simple way to start the conversation because everything has a life cycle. It's seeing a dead possum on the road. Oh, look, that possum's died. It got hit by a car. That's as simple as it needs to be to start with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just hearing in my head, oh, kid has brought me the dead butterfly. Oh, it's sleeping. No, you're saying it's dead.
It's dead. Because if you say that that butterfly is sleeping, then that child may then be afraid to go to sleep.
As we're going up through the stages of, you said there's different language or well, not even a different language, but different levels of information we're sharing?
Completely guided by the child, because each child is different in its own right. I know that. I have 4 children and they're all completely different.
Are they?
I would often end up having conversations with them in the car. They were all strapped in the back of the car in their car seats, and they knew that Mum wasn't going to be distracted, and they didn't have to look me in the eye when they asked the questions, and they would get the answers that they asked.
Did you always live this far out of town? Because I've driven, an hour 10 to get here into this beautiful, idyllic green forest that you live in. So they had long journeys?
We've always spent a lot of time in the car. I've always lived in the Waitakere Ranges. So, driving for us was part of our daily routine. So, we did have a lot of time in the car.
What about for yourself then? So, were you raised this way? You ended up as a hospice nurse, and did you start that very early in your nursing career? Were you raised to be comfortable with death in this way?
No, I didn't. I think my first experience of death was as a 22-year-old as a nurse, and I'd already been nursing, including my training, since I was 17. So that was quite a long way into my nursing career before I experienced death, and that was in oncology in the UK. But I started out surgical nursing and then moved to oncology, and when I moved back to New Zealand, decided that we hadn't done palliative care well in the private oncology ward in the UK, and so I wanted to experience what good palliative care was, and that was my motivation for...
Palliative care, what is that? What does it actually mean? I mean, I've heard the term, but what does palliative care mean?
Living your life while you've got a terminal diagnosis.
So, good care of people with a terminal diagnosis.
Yeah.
You're caring for them to help them live their life. What does that look like? How do you do that? I mean, did you manage to experience good palliative care?
Yes. Yep.
You achieved your goal?
Yep, I did.
What did you experience?
People coming for symptom management. So they'd come in because they were troubled by pain or nausea, and they would be in for a period of time. I was only ever an inpatient nurse. I didn't work in the community. And so then we'd discharge them back home with a better plan and more support, and they could be at home doing the things they want with the people they loved until the end of their life. Yeah, we had great joy. People always say, you worked in hospice, it must have been terribly sad. I don't think I've ever laughed so much in any other job. There was a lot of joy in amongst the sadness.
I hear this a lot. Mates of mine who've worked in palliative care always say this. Now, haven't necessarily loved the bureaucracy around it, haven't necessarily loved some of the administrative side and those, human politic detail stuff, but always have this, your face has lightened up, you smiled. There's a joy around it, and it still surprises me.
I think because a lot of the time there's acceptance around the diagnosis by the time they become palliative. And so that side of it can be left behind, and they can focus on what is left to do in their life and what they want to achieve. And those hard conversations have often already been had. And so it's about spending time together and doing the things you love with the people you love and making the most of every day.
Which I think feeds into quite a good conversation at home then. So we talked about Mum it was a messy day today. Getting home where it's been a good day.
Yeah.
What are those conversations? Because the person who is at the centre of your care is terminal. They're dying. But you feel good in the work you do with them. What's the story you share at home with the children?
That how lovely it was that this person had been waiting to see this person, this family member, and they'd arrived, and the light and the joy in their face and the conversations that they were able to have and the presence in each other's company, and how healing that is for people.
What sort of healing comes to mind for you that you see in those contexts?
I think it's about acceptance and about truly seeing someone often. Because when you're dying, you're so vulnerable, and that vulnerability gives, I think, a lot of insight into people and their relationships. And I think there's an acceptance of who that person was, and maybe even if it had been a difficult relationship, why that had been. And I've seen a lot of healing in that space.
I had a conversation with Stephen Street, who, in a previous episode, who was a doctor who created organ donations in New Zealand. He talked about nurses as kaitiaki, as people accompanying someone in their readying for death, with the patient advocating for that person in all of their relationships in readying themselves for death. But also he talked about the type of nursing that you have done as also working with those close by the person who's dying.
Yeah, and that's what led me to becoming a funeral director, because I did love the work with the families. Because often when somebody did come to die in the hospice inpatient unit, there would often be days of them being unconscious. And so I couldn't have that interpersonal relationship with them because they weren't able to communicate. So you have that with the family. And the patient was always at the centre of my care, but their family is also a huge part of the care.
What did you enjoy about it?
I love family dynamics, and how every family is different. Even the most normal family has dynamics. And I love navigating those relationships and teasing out what everybody needs in their grief.
In grief, though, the facade often comes down.
Yeah.
And we forget to be well-mannered.
Yep, absolutely.
So I don't think those dynamics are polite often, and they can be pretty ugly.
They can be, but they can also be really beautiful.
At the same time?
Yeah. Yep.
Explain.
I think the most important role I have as a funeral director is listening, and it's often listening to things that aren't said. So you're often in a room with multiple family members and they're all telling you what they need, and it can be quite different. But being able to navigate and facilitate that and understand what it is they all need, it's not always going to be the case, but to do a really good job, you need to be able to understand and listen to what everybody needs and how we can manage that. And it may be that they have to do different things.
What do you mean? Who has to do different things?
Well, if members of a family can't agree about a funeral service, then maybe we do this now and then we do this later. And so everybody actually gets what they need. And that's a really important part of the grief process, is that everybody feels listened to and everybody gets what they need.
Do you ever feel caught in the middle?
Occasionally. Not often. I think sometimes you have to go away and then have another meeting. Can't always be done in one meeting. There's been times where I've had to have 3 meetings to be able to get to that point. But it's about building that relationship and building that trust, and sometimes going away and writing things down and putting them in an email and saying, this is what I've heard, this is what we've agreed on, these are the things we haven't agreed on and still need to think about, and putting it down in black and white in small achievable goals. Because when someone dies, there are a lot of decisions to be made.
So many.
And decisions are really hard to make in grief.
And in conflict.
Yep.
And I did a memorial just the other day, and siblings, twins, 20 plus years estranged. That sibling coming back into that family dynamic was pretty intense. And I just find myself just breathing and hoping it's going to be okay. Actually, not hoping anymore it's going to be okay. Knowing it's going to be okay, I think. Even if some of the behaviours are socially not normally acceptable. Sometimes for me, I'd wonder, maybe, is there a skill that I've not got that you have that I haven't learnt yet, beyond just sitting there going, it'll be all right. We can get through this.
I think it's about just taking one step at a time and not being afraid to say, I think we need to stop this now and come back to it. Because often people need time and space, especially if it's got quite heated or there is a big disagreement about something, and go, okay, we can leave that for now. We don't have to hurry to make that decision. We do have time. There's no urgency.
This is something now looping back into your experience around end-of-life nursing, hospice nursing. I was listening to a doula, Teresa Gallagly, and an end-of-life doula, and she'd said to me, one of the key things when someone dies is it's not a crisis, it's not an emergency. What's the first thing to do when someone dies? Put the kettle on.
Yep.
Don't rush to the phone.
No. Take that time. You're never going to get it back. And we often say that on the phone to people, families, when they ring us. And in some ways, if someone dies at home and the need for the doctor to come and certify that person before we remove the body is often quite a few hours, and people often say to us, I'm really glad we have had that time, because if we hadn't have had to wait for the doctor, we would have told you to come. But in having to wait for the doctor, they've had 4 or 5 hours sitting with their loved one, having a cup of tea, and just being.
What do you think happens in that time?
I think the adrenaline settles because the worst has happened. And so you just have the gift of time, and you can be together with that person and share memories and stories, and it can be a time of real joy.
And then that same thing, when I get actually that is a real moment of calm, and unless there's been a lot of advanced care planning, funeral planning all done ahead of time, which is rare, wonderful when it is done, but pretty rare in my experience, that's probably going to be the most still time they've got.
Yes.
There's one thing, when you talked about people in grief and so many decisions, if we're caught up in a conflict and I want this and you want that and they can't match, a big contributor to that is the overwhelm of how many decisions had to be made. So that other point of saying, just stop, we're all overwhelmed, come back.
Yep.
Any advice from your experience around this? If, I'm sitting there and going, okay, people close to me, whoever's going to die next is going to die next, right? Given all of your experience around this, how do I prep?
Have those conversations.
Which ones?
Do you want to be buried or cremated? If you die, do you want a funeral? Not everybody does anymore. I think the hardest funeral plannings that I do are when those conversations haven't been had. They come in and mum has died and we don't even know if she wants to be buried or cremated. We never had that conversation. We never talked about dying or death in our family, ever. And they are the hardest because people are trying to get their head around what they would like, but also what mum would like, and they may be different things.
I find this also quite an interesting conversation. So that's great advice. Let's have that. And for me is what I want once I'm dead, I'm kind of like, I think you guys need to just figure out what's going to work for you and do that.
Yeah, but even what's your favourite song?
Oh, yeah, that stuff.
Yeah, that stuff. Because that's part of what makes your funeral about you.
Yeah.
Do you have a favourite poem? Is there anyone you don't want to speak if you have a funeral?
Yes.
You know, I've had those conversations with my family. They know that, and it's changed what I would like. In my time as a funeral director, I used to want to be cremated. Now I've decided I'd like to be buried. But I've said to my family that if it isn't convenient, then you can cremate me. If for whatever reason I die at the other end of the country or in a different country and it's easier to cremate me and then bring me home, then do that. Because at the end of the day, it's about what's easiest for you in that time. But in an ideal world, I would like a graveside burial and I would like to come home for you to have time to say goodbye to me.
I like that this conversation actually doesn't feel like it has much jeopardy and emotional loading to it, in that if we're talking with kids, with partner, with friends about, okay, what are your funeral songs? What are my funeral songs? What's your, right? But when that person has gone, it's like, oh, they wanted this and she wanted that and this would be fun. And
Yeah.
but it doesn't feel like a difficult. So I started this conversation around conversations you had with your children, which frankly, quite shocking for those of us who don't have those conversations. But this sounds like a fun one.
Yeah. It is. My kids have even looked at the casket brochure and said which caskets they'd like. Some they don't really like at all, and others they're like, yes, that one's for me.
That sounds like it's going to make everything a little easier.
Yeah.
I'm curious then, probably getting towards the end of our conversation, and I'll ask you in a minute of what your takeaways might be from your nursing time, but particularly with a parenting insight to it. That there's a playful creativity around that conversation with this casket, that casket, the cremated or buried, those elements in there. I'm surprised that it doesn't necessarily help with processing grief.
I think it probably does, but it might be that my son was 12 when we had a really sudden tragic loss, and it was easier for him to carry on with his busy life than to actually stop and grieve, because I'd say he has grieved, but probably not to the extent that he thought he would.
Big feels.
Big feels. And when you're a teenager and a preteen, you have lots of big feelings anyway. And I think we're quite good at continuing to talk about those loved ones of ours that have died. We talk about them frequently. And I think that helps with the grieving process because it keeps the memory alive.
Nice correction that you gave me when I'm saying it doesn't or necessarily help. And you're like, no, it's helped. This is big feels though.
Yeah.
Without that, perhaps harder, more chaotic, more difficult. But the fact that this conversation is open means some of those big feels are at least softened or supported.
And the fact that he's been able to tell me that he doesn't feel like he's grieved. That's massive for a 17-year-old.
It's massive for a 56-year-old, thank you, over here. Yeah, okay. Takeouts then?
Have those conversations. Don't be afraid to use the words dead and dying. Talk to your kids. They understand far more than you realise. And I think they are better and more pragmatic about dealing with grief than we are as adults.
What about when the conversation, and if the kid follows it up and leads us into something where I've actually got to have a conversation after that really upsets me, right? Do I want to, if I get upset and confused and, in my own grief and whatever, I don't want to do that in front of my kids.
It's really important that you do, because they can see that you're sad and how it's affected you, and it will mean that they're not afraid to show their feelings.
But I'm out of control in this. I don't know how to guide them through this.
Well, tell them that. Don't be afraid to be honest, because you're a human being and so are they. And it's okay to not know the answers, but be honest about it, and we'll figure this out together.
I think we've begun to. Thank you for the conversation. This is At a Loss, little conversations about when life throws something at us that we weren't perhaps ready for. And with Sarah Cannon, there's conversations about being a little bit more ready. So thank you.
You're welcome.
If you've got some feedback, then you can email me, celebrant@aloss.nz. That's at aloss.nz.